Dragon for Dinner by Sheree Elaine, narrated by Craig Griffith. Chapter 1. The smell of sweat, fake leather, and rubber hit James as he walked onto the bus after an exceptionally unexceptional Tuesday at school. 6th grade already felt repetitive, and it had only been a few weeks. He still had recess at least, until next year when he'd go to middle school. He slid into his assigned seat next to his sister Grace. She glanced up from her recipe book just long enough to acknowledge him and scoot over to give him more space. James looked over his shoulder to the back of the bus and then sat back with a disgruntled huff. No Ben. His eyes moved to the front doors of the bus every few seconds. His hands were slightly sweaty as he gripped his blue notebook tightly to his chest. Annoyance and anticipation filled him. "James, what do you think about this?" Grace asked. She nudged his shoulder and pointed to a pastry recipe in her book. "Looks delicious. And complicated. Chilling the dough, folding, rolling..." Wham! A pain exploded in the side of James' head. The force of the impact made him drive his shoulder into Grace. His blue notebook fell to the floor as his hands went to his head. Ben had gotten him again. He blinked back the water that gathered in his eyes. "Hey!" Grace said loudly, pushing James away and looking around. His sister had always had more spice than her homemade chicken wings, and those things had a kick to them. James was the quieter, more level-headed of the two. He wasn't worried about her riding on the bus alone next year. "Grace, be quiet, it's fine." The throbbing in the side of his head was already dying down. Grace looked at James, biting her lip. Eventually, she exhaled and turned back to her recipe. James reached down and picked up his notebook. He wiped away as much dirt as he could. A small growl of frustration escaped the back of his throat when he saw the bent corner. "Just great. I've never made something this complicated before, and it takes a lot of butter, but I think Mom would be okay with it. I'll ask her before she goes to the store," Grace said. "I'm sure she'd be fine with it. What is it she always says? An investment in your passion is an investment in joy?" "Something like that," Grace responded with a small smile that didn't fully cover the concern in her eyes. James looked away quickly, and his sister turned back to her book. James knew that once she got her mind fixed on the recipe, she would be lost to the world until their bus stop. Grace often told James that she would be a world-famous chef someday. He fully believed her. She was more than capable. At only 9 years old, Grace was the most talented cook he knew. She insisted on cooking most of the meals at home, which is pretty impressive for a 4th grader. He had almost never had anything of hers that he didn't like. When not in the kitchen cooking, Grace would have her nose in a cookbook or her eyes on one of her favorite cooking shows. A few minutes later, the bus pulled up to their stop. 7 kids got up and filed out of the bus. Luckily, Ben's stop was after theirs, so he stayed at the back of the bus. "Why do you let him elbow you?" Grace asked softly once they had exited the bus and began their walk home. James asked, turning toward her. He'd been flipping through his notebook, still trying to think of a story for the mayor's writing competition as they walked. "I said, why do you let him elbow you?" James felt his face warm as he realized that his little sister was referring to the ongoing bullying he had dealt with since the school year had started. It wasn't the kind of bullying that sent you running to a teacher. Not that James was like that anyway. It was more the type of bullying that someone did to keep you in your place and show you how unimportant they thought you were. Ben was that kind of bully. Almost every day when Ben passed James on the bus, he'd throw out his elbow and knock him in the head. It wasn't really painful, just rude and definitely annoying. Well, maybe it was a little painful. "Why don't you say anything? Tell him to stop. Or tell the bus driver or Mom," Grace asked, her blue eyes full of concern. Her eyes always reminded him of their dad. James' eyes were dark brown like their mom. While he and his sister had the same shade of brown hair, James' hair was straight and Grace's was a mop of unruly curls. Dad claims that if he could grow his hair out, it would be curly too. We may never know with his preferred short military cut. James absent-mindedly rubbed at the small dark mark on his cheekbone beneath his right eye, a birthmark that has faded a lot since he was born but is more noticeable in the colder months. James dropped his hand and exhaled. He rolled his shoulders forward defensively. "It probably would just make it worse, and I'm fine. It's not a big deal," James said with a shrug, looking back at his notebook. Saying it and feeling it were two different things. Sometimes he was able to see the elbow coming and duck, Ben would just keep walking. On other occasions, like today, he did nail him pretty hard. No one could depend on the bus driver to see anything. He always had his headphones in, just trying to get through the drive with a bunch of rowdy kids. Maybe, but... Grace started. She kicked a small rock with the toe of her shoe. Are you making dinner tonight? James asked before she could finish her sentence, knowing this was a surefire way to change the subject. Grace started bouncing slightly as she walked, her thumbs hooked through her backpack straps. I am. Chicken croissants. It's a chicken and cream cheese mixture inside a nice soft dough. I'll make a sauce to go on top of it. It's my first time making the dough, so hopefully it turns out. Sounds amazing, and I don't think you've ever served anything at dinner that I haven't liked, James said honestly. Except for the cauliflower Alfredo sauce, I know. Mom and I thought it was great. I'm not sure what you and Dad have against cauliflower, Grace said, rolling her eyes. James was about to give his case against the white vegetable when they came to their neighbor Stan's house. He looked over and saw Stan sitting on his front porch, in the rocking chair, waving. Grace looked at James with wide eyes. I can't stop and talk today. I have a lot of homework to finish before starting on dinner. She shifted the weight of her backpack, looking between Stan and their house. No problem. I'll go. I could use a good Stan story. Maybe I'll get some inspiration for the mayor's newspaper competition. James turned to walk up Stan's driveway as Grace continued on home. Chapter 2. Hey, Stan, James said. He sat down on the swing next to Stan's rocking chair. Any time James stopped to talk with Stan, this was their position. Stan in his rocking chair, James on the swing. It happened often enough that it felt natural, almost a habit. James noticed a bag sitting on the porch at Stan's feet. Hello, James. What was school like for you today? James looked back up at Stan. Pretty normal. Learning, lunch, recess, more learning. We do have a new assignment for English. We need to write and submit a short article for the mayor's writing competition. Oh, the one for the newspaper? Stan asked, his bushy gray eyebrows raised above the rim of his thick glasses. Yes, the winner gets $100 and a once-a-month column in the newspaper for a year. It just has to be about 700 words and have some kind of theme that will run through the 12 months. Oh, yes, I read the newspaper regularly. Most people prefer the internet for their news these days, but I say you can't replace the smell and feel of a good old newspaper in your hands. The article you're talking about, this year it was a gardening advice column, but I've seen it be poetry, interviews with members of the community, a pet highlight column. One year someone made it a story that ended on a cliffhanger each month. That was fun. What do you think you'll do? I'm not sure. I really love writing. You know, I want to be a reporter when I grow up. Oh yes, you've mentioned it, he said with a smile. It has to be really good and creative to win. I've thought maybe a sci-fi story with robots, but no fully formed ideas came. James thought of all the half-written stories in his notebook. None of them felt right. So then I thought maybe a monthly building challenge, but how would I make that 700 words each month? Then I thought maybe I'd do a military family life highlight, but I think that'd just make me miss my dad more. I'll keep thinking, but I have to think fast. The first draft is due in 2 days. I'm sure you'll think of something amazing, Stan said encouragingly. These apples are for your family, by the way. He picked the grocery bag off the ground next to his feet and set it on the swing next to James. He looked into the bag, and the sweet smell of fresh yellow and green apples hit James, causing his stomach to growl. Thanks. Are these from one of your trees? James asked. They sure are. Freshly picked this morning. The trees are having a really good year again. Those trees are almost as old as these houses, you know. He gestured at his own house, and then down the road. James took off his backpack, set it by his feet, and settled into the swing. He could feel a Stan story coming on. When I was growing up, we had an apple orchard behind our house. It was only half a dozen trees, but we still called it an orchard. It was always about this time of year that me and my brother and sister would be climbing the trees and picking apples. Stan had gotten a faraway look in his eyes, a reminiscent smile on his face. We would have competitions to see who could pick the most apples. Being the oldest, I usually won. I had the advantage of being able to reach the higher branches. The fall air had a sort of crispness to it, that would match the crunch of the apples, not unlike today, in fact. Some days we'd be picking apples for hours. My mother would make the best apple pie you could ever imagine. That's not all, though. She'd make applesauce and put it in glass bottles, pie filling too. Apple juice day was always a fun day. My mother would clean and save milk jugs and other containers throughout the year and then fill them up with fresh apple juice we made with our apple trees. It takes a lot of apples to get enough juice, about 35 apples to make a gallon of apple juice. We'd fill up a wheelbarrow, being careful not to get any rotten ones. Then we'd hose off the apples and run them through the press. Have you ever seen an apple press? I don't think so, James admitted. The one we had was once my grandmother's, so very old. It has a big wooden barrel below it that would catch the apple pulp and a wheel you would turn to grind the apples and get the juice out. It's a little tricky to describe now that I'm trying. Stan laughed. My siblings and I would always want to be the one to turn the wheel, but our turns got shorter and shorter as our arms became tired. Then it was my father's job to keep the wheel cranking. As the juice came out of the press, it would develop a layer of foam, so my mother would skim that off, boil the juice for a minute or two, and then put it into the bottles to freeze. If we had any leftover apples, we would sell them. My father had a good job and worked hard, but it was always nice to have the extra for new shoes, school clothes, unexpected doctor visits, or car repairs, things like that. Cheryl and I bought this house when we were newlyweds. One of the first things we did was plant those 2 trees in the backyard. It took several years for them to start producing apples. They've been consistent ever since. Except for that one year we had a strange late spring freeze. We lost the blossoms that year and didn't get many apples. Cheryl was always so dedicated to those trees. She never missed a pruning, watering, or picking. She would never waste a single apple. If there were more apples than the 2 of us could eat ourselves, she would give them to neighbors or take them to the local food bank. Stan paused, looking off in the distance, lost in the memory of his late wife. He cleared his throat and glanced quickly at James. I'd better not keep you any longer, or your mom is going to start wondering where you are. Nah, I'm sure Grace told her where I am, James said. How's your mom holding up with your dad being gone again? We all miss him, but I think she's used to it at this point. He goes for training and assignments often enough. She has started working in the mornings at a dentist's office, filing paperwork and setting up appointments. I think she likes getting out of the house. I imagine she would. Military family life isn't for the faint of heart. Tell her hi for me, and don't forget the apples, Stan said, pointing to the bag. James stood and picked up the bag of apples. He walked with an added sway as the apples hit his calf with each step. When he went down the porch steps, the weight of the apples tugged at his shoulder. He held his other arm wrapped around his notebook, pulled safely against his middle. Good luck with your writing assignment. I'm sure you'll find the inspiration you need. Thanks, James said half-heartedly. He really hoped that Stan was right. Chapter 3. James, Mom said cheerfully when James entered the living room. It didn't matter where he'd been or for how long, Mom always sounded excited to see him. She sat on the couch, leaning over her laptop, a pile of bills on the coffee table in front of her. Grace told me you were with Stan. I know he appreciates you taking the time to visit with him. Gets lonely over there by himself, but he sure has the best stories. He really does. He was telling me about the apple orchard that was behind his house when he was growing up. When he tells a story, he really makes you feel like you're there. These are from him. He said to tell you hi, James said, handing her the bag of apples. That's so kind of him. These look delicious. Do you want one? She asked. She pulled a bright green apple out of the bag for him. Thanks, James said, taking it, knowing he would have to wash it before taking a bite. Maybe we should plant an apple tree. I wouldn't know the first thing about keeping a tree alive. She smiled and shrugged. Do you have any homework? Always. The most important one is to come up with the first draft for the mayor's writing competition. It's due in 2 days. I still don't have a great idea. Or any idea. I remember you mentioning that project a few days ago. Yikes. Now you're on a time crunch. You'll think of something. You always do. Thanks, Mom. I'll go start on it now. James washed the apple in the kitchen and took a bite. He enjoyed the crunchy sweetness as he walked up the stairs to his room. He set his apple core and notebook on the desk. He opened his notebook to a blank page and hoped the inspiration would come. He dribbles down the court, unfazed by the giant men closing in around him. He finds an opening. He ducks down under the arm of an opponent. He jumps, he shoots, he scores! Or not. The crumpled up paper bounced off the mountain of other already crumpled papers that filled the wastebasket and fell to the floor. With a big sigh, James turned back to his notebook and hoped that the fresh blue-lined paper would give him inspiration. His notebook was a lot thinner than it was an hour ago. He glanced at the clock. The hours between after school and bedtime were quickly fading. "Knock, knock," Mom said. James swiveled his chair and saw her leaning against the doorframe. "How's the writing assignment coming along? Can I read what you got so far?" "Sure, tell me what you think." James handed her his notebook. Mom glanced at the blank page and then up at James. "Sarcasm, huh?" Mom handed James' notebook back to him, her eyebrows raised. "Sorry, I'm just frustrated. I've never had a problem writing before. What if this isn't just writer's block? What if my writing days are over and my dream of becoming a reporter is finished before I've even started?" "James, you're spiraling. Take a deep breath, maybe walk away for a few minutes. I'm sure the words will come." "Okay, maybe you're right," he said as he leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms over his head. "I believe in you. You've got this. I actually just came up to grab Grace so we could start making dinner. She's come up with a great meal idea." James nodded in agreement. "She was telling me about it on the bus." "I was going to ask you about the bus, actually. I've got to work on this assignment. Sorry, no time to talk." James swiveled back around to face his desk and leaned over his notebook. He heard his mom let out a huff. James was sure she would have pressed the issue if it hadn't been for the doorbell ringing. He heard the sound of her footsteps heading toward the stairs. A few moments later, he heard the front door open. Chapter 4. "Stan, what a surprise!" James heard Mom's voice carry up the stairs and through his open door. "Come in. Can I help you with that?" she asked. "Oh, I'm fine for the moment." Stan was breathing hard and his words came out strained. "I'm actually wondering if I could talk to James for a moment." "Absolutely. Let me get him." James was at the top of the stairs just as his mom was inhaling to yell his name. "Hey, Stan is here to see you." She gestured silently for James to hurry, and when he got to the bottom of the stairs, he saw why. Stan stood just inside the door, balancing an old cardboard box on his hip. The sound of a bowl hitting the counter came from the kitchen. "That must be Grace starting on dinner," Mom said. She left to see if Grace needed help. "Can I take that from you?" James asked. He watched a line of sweat slide down Stan's temple toward his ear. James reached forward and the two of them set the box on the small table just inside the door. "Thank you. I may have overestimated my strength in carrying those over here." James wasn't sure how to respond, so he just clasped his hands behind his back and leaned over to look in the box. Books. No wonder Stan was struggling to carry it. A dozen thickly bound books were lined up inside the box. The titles of the books were barely visible along the spine and were printed in gold. "These books were given to me when I was about your age. They've been passed down for many, many years. I always planned to pass them along to one of my own children, but since Cheryl and I never had any, I would like you to have them. I was thinking about your struggle with writer's block and thought these might help. I dug them out of the attic after you left with the apples. It's a fantasy series, just right for sparking the imagination." He looked at the books with a half-smile. He ran his hand along their spines with the same look he gets when telling a long story. James felt honored that Stan would pass along these books to him. They were clearly close to his heart. "Thank you, Stan. I love to read." James glanced at the faded titles. Many of the letters were missing, and he couldn't really make any of them out in the poorly lit entryway. "Do you want to stay for dinner? Grace is making chicken something. Just about everything she makes is good." "Mighty generous of you, but I'm heading to the senior center for pickleball. I haven't missed a single game in months and wouldn't want them to worry." He glanced at his watch. "In fact, I'd better get going." "Thanks again for the books. I'll take good care of them." Stan looked one more time at the books and said, "I'm sure you will treasure them as much as I did. Such great memories." Stan opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. James began to close the door behind him. "Wait," Stan said. He turned around and put his hand out to stop the door. "Just remember that there's a certain magic to reading a book for the first time." The way Stan emphasized the word magic made James pull his head back slightly, eyebrows lowered. Stan gave a final nod and took his hand off the door. He waved goodbye, and James watched him shuffle back toward his own home before closing the door. James lifted the box off the side table, and immediately his knees wanted to buckle. How had Stan carried these all the way from his house to theirs? James straightened his back with determination. If Stan could carry the box from his house, then he could carry the box up the stairs. He swung the box around and set it on the 4th step up. He took a deep breath, stood on the 1st step, and picked the box back up. He took another step and staggered sideways. Leaning on the railing, he managed to make it up a few more steps. He set the box down again and looked to the top of the stairs, breathing hard, his hands on his sides. Another big breath, and he lifted the box again. This time he made it to the top of the stairs. He placed the edge of the box on the corner table outside his door. He was careful not to bump the delicate, decorative vase on the table. Mom and Dad got it for their wedding and only recently pulled it out again. They were happy that Grace and James were finally old enough not to be a danger to it. He didn't want to prove them wrong by knocking it off the table with a box of books. A final deep breath, and James made it into his room and dropped the box onto his bed. Catching his breath, he closed his door, leaving it slightly ajar so he could hear when dinner was ready. He looked between his notebook, that had been left open with a blank page looking up at him, and the new books that Stan promised would bring him inspiration. Instead of heading to his desk, he took a closer look at the books in the box. The spines of the books were all face up. The titles were too worn to read, even in the better lighting of his room. He could make out the faint numbers along the bottom of the spines. 12 books. He picked up the book with the number 1 and pulled it from the box. The cover was almost as worn as the spine, but he could make out some kind of creature on the front. He opened the book to the title page. The Forgotten Dragon, by Game Remnul. That is a strange name for an author. Must be a pen name. He flipped to the first page and began to read. Time stood still as the words pulled him entirely into the book. The boy stood behind the old wooden door listening. The light from his candle flickered as he strained to hear. The wind blew lightly around the outside of their small cottage, rustling leaves and making it harder. He knew eavesdropping was wrong, but he also knew that no adult in their small town would mention dragons in front of any children. It had always been his greatest desire to learn more, but if he ever asked, he was quickly silenced and warned against asking such questions. He leaned in closer. He could barely make out the gravelly voice of the elder speaking to his father. "We must remember and keep the memory alive. The council wishes that no one speak of the time of the dragons, but it must be remembered." He heard the strong, familiar voice of his father answering. "Sir, dragons are a myth, something children tell stories about when they think adults won't overhear. That is what the council would wish you to believe. They would like to forget, because it's simpler than the truth." The truth. The boy heard a chair scrape and imagined his father standing from his chair. "Yes, the truth of the magic, the force that binds the wind and the sky, the truth of our ancestors, and the stories buried over generations, the stories passed on selectively and secretively throughout time." "Why have you chosen me?" his father asked reverently. "Your character has spoken for itself these last few years. This decision is never made lightly. You will be the next one burdened, as I have been, with the knowledge of the Forgotten Dragon." The boy heard nothing through the door for a few moments. He slowly backed away before he was caught eavesdropping. The floor beneath him squeaked, and he held his breath, hoping no one had heard. The door swung open. James' hands became warm, very warm. He looked at his hands, firmly grasping the book in shock. The warmth spread up his arms to his elbows. The temperature of the book increased quickly, and James dropped the book with a sharp yell of pain. He looked at his hands, expecting to see red burns and blisters, but there was nothing, not even a hint of red. The book landed on the ground, cover down, pages up. He felt a breeze blow across the side of his face. He looked toward the window. It was closed, just as he'd left it. The mysterious breeze ruffled the pages of the book until they stopped. James stood to look at the open pages, but before he could get a good look, a flash of light filled the room. He put his arms up to shield his eyes. When he lowered his arm, he had to blink a few times to clear the black dots that obscured his vision. As his sight returned, he realized there was something blinking back at him. Chapter 5. Black eyes were the first thing James saw. His wide eyes moved from the black eyes to the long snout. Its sharp white teeth distracted him momentarily from what appeared to be a smile on the creature's face. Blue scales covered its body, spikes ran down its back all the way down to a thick, powerful tail twitching from side to side. It wasn't until the creature shifted its weight from one leg to the other that he saw blue wings folded tightly against its body. There was no mistaking this creature. There was a dragon in his room. "Something smells good. Who are you?" the dragon said with a tilt of its head. James stood, mouth open, barely breathing. Should he scream? Run? He couldn't get his body to move. A dragon in his room. It took James a minute to process that the dragon had actually asked him a question. "James." His voice came out raspy and dry. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I'm James." "Hi, James. Is this your room?" "Look how small I am. Last time I came out of the book, I was at the park, and I was huge. What's cooking?" James took a step backwards and fell down onto his bed, staring. Maybe this one can't talk." The dragon tilted its head to the side, staring hard at James. "Oh, wait, no. He said his name is Jack. He can talk." "Oh, I've surprised him. Okay, I'll talk slowly. Hello, Jack. How are you?" "It's James," James replies, a little stronger than before. "And yes, this is my room. How? How did you get here? Are you real? Did I fall asleep? Is this a dream? Who are you?" James looked around as if there was some explanation somewhere. It felt real, but maybe he fell asleep reading. That would make more sense. "Let's see, we are speaking English, so you can call me Blue. And if you were dreaming, would you feel this?" Blue asked. In one big leap, he was perched on James' knee, gripping tight. He got within an inch of James' face and then leaned in quickly and touched James' nose with his own. James had to admit to himself that both the pressure on his leg and the feel of the dragon's dry, rough nose definitely felt real. There was a dragon in his room, on his knee, in his face. "How did you get here?" James asked. "One minute I was reading, the book got hot in my hands, so hot that I had to drop it. Then the pages blew and you... I came out of the book," the dragon finished for him. James nodded. He leaned away from the dragon and placed his arm on the bed behind him for support. "I come out of the book the first time someone reads it. I've met hundreds of kids all over your world." Blue seemed unable to hold still for long. He jumped from James's knee, onto the desk chair, and then onto his desk, accidentally knocking the lamp with one of his wings. James jumped up and steadied the lamp before it fell. "Are you done with this?" Blue asked, pointing to the slightly brown apple core with a curved talon. He tossed it in the air, caught it in his mouth, and swallowed it whole. "How?" James asked again. He felt his reporter instincts kicking in. Blue jumped off the desk. He landed with a small crash, then used one of his back legs to scratch at his scaly belly. James glanced at the door, expecting Mom or Grace to come see what all the noise was about. When no one came, he grabbed his notebook and pen and sat back down on the edge of his bed. Blue was nosing through the crumpled-up papers on the floor. A precariously placed one dropped from the edge of the wastebasket. Blue pounced on the paper like a cat catching a mouse. He walked back towards James and kicked the crumpled paper with his back leg, causing it to bounce off the wall behind him. He sat down in the middle of the floor and looked up into James's eyes. "You're asking the wrong guy. It's just the magic of the books." "Books? All of them?" "I think so. I'm not around when the other books are read, but they're all from the same author." James stood and picked another book from the box. Blue was right. Game Remnel was under the title of this one, too. He placed the book back in the box. Any chance I'm going to get any of whatever that great smell is? Blue turned toward the door and took a great breath in, lifting his head and exhaling again with a little sigh. So, you don't know how. Do you know why? Why did you appear here in my room? Now, James asked, ignoring Blue's question. Like I said, it's magic. When the right kid comes along and reads my book for the first time, I appear. What makes me the right kid? I'm just me. James thought again about his exceptionally unexceptional day. Usually there's a problem that needs to be solved. I come, fix the problem, then go back into my book. James stared, his head tilted to the side. He doesn't have any problem that can be solved by a dragon, that's for sure. His mind wandered to Ben, but he quickly pushed the thought away. Unless Blue could eat him... James pushed that thought away too. I don't have a problem, James said firmly. That's usually what they say, Blue sighed. It'll come out eventually. It always does. Well, hello there, Blue said, looking toward the door. James turned to see what caught Blue's attention. Bootsy, the family cat, had sensed the commotion and was coming to investigate. Bootsy was all black with white paws, giving her the appearance of wearing boots. She was a Christmas gift to Grace and James a few years ago. The cat crept into the room slowly. She skirted the edge of the room and never took her eyes off the dragon. Blue held perfectly still, not even twitching his tail. He simply returned Bootsy's stare. Gathering her courage, Bootsy walked towards Blue, nose twitching. As she came close enough to sniff him, Blue suddenly let out a deep rumbling snarl. Bootsy jumped more than a foot into the air with a loud screechy meow and dashed out of the room. The noise scared Blue and he dashed under the bed. The room was silent for a few heartbeats, and then James burst into laughter. Blue stuck his head out from under the bed and looked up at James sheepishly. What? I didn't know she'd be that loud, Blue said defensively. He crawled out from under the bed. Normally I'd be a lot bigger than her. What do you mean? James moved to the desk and added what he'd learned to his notebook. My normal size would be bigger than this room, possibly bigger than your house. It's all a part of the magic, Blue said, as he hopped in circles trying to catch his tail. He managed to get his tail in his mouth, but when he let out a triumphant "Gotcha!" his tail whipped out and knocked over the bin of mini building bricks next to James's bed. Oops, sorry, Blue said. He hopped backwards away from the bricks and knocked into James's backpack. It fell over with another crash. Stop! My mom and sister are going to hear you, James said. Oh, yeah? Blue had a mischievous glint in his eye. We'll see about that. Before James could stop him, Blue pushed the door the rest of the way open with his nose. Blue dashed out the door and out of sight. Chapter 6. Not good. James jumped off his bed and ran into the hallway towards the stairs. He was just in time to see Blue spread his wings and jump. His heart rate continued to climb as he bounded to the top of the steps. He looked to the bottom of the stairs just in time to see Blue land a graceful glide, fold in his wings, take a great sniff, and walk toward the kitchen. James took the stairs down 3 at a time. He grabbed the banister and swung himself around toward the kitchen. He used the momentum from the banister and launched himself toward the kitchen. He slammed into the frame of the open door and froze. Blue was in the middle of the counter just inches away from where Grace was preparing dinner. Are you okay? Dinner is not ready yet, Grace said. She watched as James rubbed his arm where he'd hit the door frame. Mom stood with her back to the kitchen door, dicing chicken. She gave him a worried look. Grace continued adding spices to the bowl in front of her. She appeared completely oblivious to the little blue dragon in front of her. Yeah, totally. Why wouldn't I be? James asked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. His arm still throbbed a little where he had hit it. You sure bolted down here fast, Mom said. We heard you crashing down the stairs. No, not crashing, just hungry, James said. Have you seen anything strange in here, Grace? James's eyes shifted from Grace to Blue and back a few times. No, she said slowly. James's shoulders dropped as a feeling of relief filled him. Well, actually, she said. James's shoulders tensed again. Bootsy did shoot through here a few minutes ago. She was making a strange hiss sound and went straight under the couch in the living room. I think she's still there, Grace said. She stood on her toes and leaned over the counter, straining to see out the kitchen door to the living room. I wonder what scared her. Blue lifted his head to catch James's eye and snickered, then went back to sniffing the bowl in front of Grace. That couldn't be sanitary. James held his breath as Blue leaned even closer to the food, and a small line of drool slowly dripped over his gums. James plunged forward and snatched the bowl away just in time. Blue's drool barely missed and landed on the counter. Mom swung around, still holding her knife, startled by the noise and Grace's gasp. They both stared at James. He stood there holding the bowl defensively. Blue snickered again. Neither Mom nor Grace glanced in the dragon's direction. James let out a nervous cough and slowly put the bowl back on the counter. Sorry, he said. I thought it was going to fall. You know what? I'm just going to go back to my room. Now. He emphasized the last 3 words with a pointed look at Blue. Okay, Grace said, her eyes tilted and one eyebrow raised. Dinner will be ready in another 20-ish minutes. Mom gave James a strange look as she used the knife to scrape the chicken off the cutting board and into Grace's mixing bowl. James turned to leave. Blue hopped off the counter and followed at his heels. No one flinched at the sound of his feet and then tail hitting the floor. As James took his first step up the stairs, he heard his mom say, Well, that was strange. Boys are so weird, Grace agreed. Blue snickered for the 3rd time. James slapped a hand to his forehead. That was embarrassing. He waited until they were both in his room and then closed the door firmly behind them. What was that? He asked Blue. I just wanted to see what was for dinner, Blue said, making his eyes wide and tilting his head to the side. Puppy dog eyes on a dragon? Really? James tried to be mad, but the whole situation was still making his head spin. They can't see you, James said. It wasn't a question. He sat down at his desk and picked up his pencil. He began adding notes in his notebook. Only I can see you. You and Footsie, Blue said. Bootsy, James corrected. Right, Bootsy. I wonder if she'll ever come out from under the couch again. Not my biggest concern right now, James said. He made another note before throwing down his pencil. Oh, so there is a problem to solve, Blue said. He jumped up, putting his front legs on the arm of James's chair to see what he wrote. Yeah, there's a dragon in my room that only I can see, James said. He rolled his chair back, making Blue drop to all 4 legs again. He moved to sit on his bed. He put his elbows on his knees and rubbed his forehead with the tips of his fingers. Blue let out a puff of smoke. That's not a problem. Do you perhaps have a rash? A rash? No! Dramatic fear of heights? A girl whose heart you are trying to win? A horse that's run away? No, and no. His face became warm at the question about a girl's heart. An enemy, then. There must be something. James paused, his mind going to Ben again. He is not discussing that with a dragon, especially one that may only be inside his head. Nope, none of those either, James said. It'll come out eventually. Problems always do, Blue said confidently. James laid back on his bed, head turned so he could still see Blue. They stared at each other for a few moments. Blue expectantly, James stubbornly. Like I said, no problems here. He turned to look up at the ceiling. Blue crawled under the desk and thumped his tail rhythmically on the floor. James swung his legs off the bed and stood. He sat in his desk chair and leaned down to look at Blue. How many times have you done this? James asked. Curled up under a desk? Plenty of times. Desks aren't exactly a new invention, and they're cozy like my cave back home. James wrote more notes in his notebook. I mean, how many times have you come out of your book? I told you before. Hundreds. My job is to help solve problems, to get kids unstuck, to teach, inspire, or correct. Whatever is needed. Before James could tell Blue again that he didn't have a problem, the call, "Time for dinner," echoed up the stairs. Chapter 7. Dinner! Yes! Blue said as he hopped toward the door. Not for you, big guy. James lunged in front of the bedroom door. You can't come to dinner. I'm hungry. Why not? Blue asked, leaning to the left to sneak around James's leg. James shuffled left to block his escape attempt. My mom and Grace are going to think I'm crazy if they see me talking to you.
It will look like I'm talking to myself or an imaginary friend or something. Imaginary friend? I have a few of those. Sometimes I'm in the book for a long time, and the other characters can get a little boring.
That's not the point, James interrupted.
Just pretend I'm not there. I'll sneak my own food.
James, dinner! Mom shouted up the stairs, slightly louder this time. Coming! James yelled over his shoulder. He looked down at Blue and wondered again how on earth a dragon can make puppy dog eyes. Fine, you can come, but not a sound out of you.
They wouldn't hear me if I did.
You know what I mean. Don't knock something over with your tail or anything.
You got it. I'll be the best behaved dragon you've ever had to dinner.
That's what I'm worried about. James opened the door and stood to the side. Blue bolted out the door, but instead of going right toward the stairs, he went left. James heard the crash and closed his eyes, not wanting to see the damage. He took a deep breath and slowly opened his eyes.
I turned the wrong way,
Blue said unnecessarily. He was standing over Mom and Dad's wedding gifted vase. It was split in two along a decorative seam in the artwork of the vase. James quickly picked up the pieces and set them back on the side table. Maybe he could glue it back together later and no one would notice. Hopefully no one saw it before he got the chance. Let's go, James said, trying to keep annoyance out of his tone. It didn't escape his notice that Blue walked very intentionally the rest of the way to the kitchen. Wow, you sure came slowly for someone that was starving only a few minutes ago, Mom said when they entered the kitchen. She and Grace were already seated at the round dining room table. Just trying to think of an idea for my writing assignment. James shrugged nonchalantly and sat down. Blue settled down on the floor next to him and said, I wish you had a baby in the house. They'd drop everything. James resisted, rolling his eyes as he reached for a chicken croissant. This looks amazing, Grace, James said as he ladled the sauce on top of his croissant. I bet it tastes just as amazing, she said with a slight frown. Sorry, James said again, unable to truly explain what kept him longer than normal. He glanced down and saw Blue sniffing at crumbs that had fallen to the ground while Grace and Mom prepared dinner. He took a claw and scratched at a dried-up spill on the floor. He sniffed at the spill and then let out a table-shaking sneeze. James jumped in his seat and looked down. Everything okay? Mom gasped. She glanced at Grace, who shrugged her shoulders, then looked back at James, waiting for an explanation. Yep, just, a leg cramp. All good now, he said, with a grimace that he hoped could pass as a smile. This was going to be an interesting dinner. Chapter 8. Tell me more about school today, Mom said, taking a bite of broccoli. Not much to report, Grace said. Same old routine. Mrs. Bailey did say we will have a historical wax museum project due after fall break. We have to pick someone from history and dress up like them and answer a bunch of questions. We do most of the work in class, but we'll need to make a presentation board at home. That sounds fun. Do you have any idea who you want to be? James was momentarily distracted when Blue stood on his hind legs and stretched his neck to look over the edge of the table. His left wing was just inches from Grace's shoulder. Not yet. Mrs. Bailey said she would send home a list of ideas before the weekend. I look forward to seeing more of the project. How was school for you, James? Still liking Mrs. Anderson? Yes, she's nice. School was good, James said, watching Blue snatch a piece of broccoli from the table. James thought Blue would enjoy a croissant more and added two to his plate in hopes of sneaking one to him when no one was looking. He looked up from his plate to see Mom still looking at him. Grace was looking at him too, with really big eyes as though trying to silently communicate. What else do you want to know? Tell her about the bus, Grace said. What about the bus? Mom asked. Nothing. Just a normal bus drive, James said pointedly, with a glare at Grace. She crossed her arms and returned his glare. Okay, what's going on, you two? Mom said. She set down her fork and set her crossed arms on the table. Before James could get another word out, Grace blurted, There's a kid on the bus picking on James. James looked at her, mortified. Why did she say that? And why did she have to say it like that? What is he, 2? It's fine. There's no problem. I can handle it. But you're not handling it. You just let him knock you in the head every day. Not every day, James said. He could feel his stomach clench, and he pushed the food around on his plate. Stop. Back up, Mom said, twirling her pointer finger and pointing to James. Who's knocking you in the head? Just some kid on the bus. It's not a big deal, James said forcefully. He felt warm and couldn't help squirming in his seat. All eyes were on him. He looked down and saw that Blue had a very smug, knowing look on his face. James looked back up at Mom and could see the transformation from Mom to Mama Bear. I sensed there was something going on with the bus, but I didn't know it was this serious. I'll call the school and have them talk to the bus driver. There's no way this is okay. How long has this been going on? I'll leave a message with the school right now. If they think they are getting away with this, they have another thing coming. Mom pushed her chair back from the table and stood. James jumped to his feet. No, Mom. This is why I didn't say anything. I want to handle this on my own. Grace slapped her head to her forehead and mumbled something like, boys, under her breath. Mom stood looking at James, chewing on her lip and thinking. After a moment, she slowly sat back down in her chair and scooted back up to the table. James took that as a sign that it was safe for him to sit too. He looked at his plate and noticed that both chicken croissants were gone. He didn't have much appetite anymore anyway. Maybe I'm overreacting. Okay, I won't say anything for now. Please, promise me that if it doesn't stop, or if it gets worse, you'll let me step in? I promise, James said. Grace blew air through her closed lips, sounding like a disgruntled horse. The plates were empty and everyone was very full when James stood to do his dinner-time chore. Grace cooked, so she didn't have a chore. She went to her room to finish homework. Mom started on dishes as James cleared the table. Blue jumped onto the table and was licking plates as fast as he could, before James took them to the sink. I'm heading back up to work on my English project, James said, once the table was cleared and wiped down. Good luck, Mom said over her shoulder as James headed toward the stairs. Blue followed right behind him. Chapter 9. Blue talked fast as he and James ascended the stairs. I was right. The food was amazing. Sorry for snatching the croissants off your plate. I couldn't help myself. You had everyone distracted. That chicken was so perfectly cooked and the sauce spot on. Grace is going to make a great chef someday. James let him prattle on, not responding in case Mom or Grace could hear. When they reached the top of the stairs, James cringed at the broken vase next to his door. I have to write my paper. I'll fix it tomorrow. As soon as they were in James's room, he closed the door. Blue stopped talking mid-sentence. James looked to see why, only to find Blue giving him a hard stare. What? James said, looking around the room, his cheeks turning warm. No enemies, huh? No problems? You mean what Grace said about Ben? That's nothing, James said, sitting down in his desk chair and swiveling toward his desk, his back to Blue. The little dragon walked over to the chair and used his front legs to swivel it back around, so James was facing him again. This is a problem, and I'm going to fix it. How? You are definitely not coming on the bus with me tomorrow. Yes, I am, because you, are talking to the bus driver. James shook his head vehemently. He won't listen, believe me. He just wants to get through his shift. Most of the time he has his headphones on for the whole drive. We are going to talk to him anyway. Make him listen. Am I a problem-solving dragon or what? Definitely what, James mumbled to himself, trying not to think about how he's going to not appear crazy while being trailed by a dragon at school tomorrow. James swiveled his chair back to the desk and turned to a blank piece of paper. Blue walked over and sat at his feet, picking at a carpet string. James looked between the dragon and his paper. This is not happening tonight. He pushed back from his desk, causing Blue to jump and look at him accusingly. James gave him an apologetic glance before sitting down on his bed. He leaned against his backboard with his knees pointed to the ceiling. He leaned his notebook against his knees and prepared to write. If he was going to have a dragon with him that only he could see, he was going to get answers. He put his pencil to the paper, looked Blue in the eye, and began his interview. Chapter 10. James woke to his alarm blaring in the quiet of his room. As the memory of his dream slipped away, his memory of the day before returned. He sat up straight in his bed and looked around. No dragon. Had it been a dream? He put his hand to his confused head and ruffled his hair as he tried to remember. Blue? He said quietly. There was no answer. Blue? He said a little louder. This time he heard a grunt coming from under his desk. James jumped to his feet and bent at his waist to look under the desk. There was a little blue dragon curled up in the corner beneath his desk.
"Stop the trumpets," Blue said groggily.
James turned off his alarm and then kneeled down to watch Blue stretch. "I thought it might have been a dream, but you're still here."
"Yep, still here until we talk to that bus driver. We're going to get Ben in so much trouble," Blue said with a strange gleam in his eye. "What's for breakfast?"
"Usually cereal."
"The hard sugar stuff with milk on top?" "No thanks. I'll catch something on the way to school."
"Catch?" James tilted his head. "Maybe I don't want to know." Grace and James said their goodbyes to Mom and headed to the bus stop. Blue followed them out the door, careful to move his tail in before it got slammed in the door.
"That was close,"
Blue said. He took a giant leap into the air and flew high above the house. James's eyes followed him as he glided and gracefully landed on Stan's house. Blue looked down from the roof, glancing left and right in what James assumed was his search for breakfast. "What are you looking at?" Grace asked, craning her neck to look where James was looking. "Nothing," he said quickly, looking down. He shot a quick glance at Stan's roof again, but Blue was gone. James stopped and spun in a half circle, scanning the sky for any sign of the dragon. "You've been acting really strange lately," Grace muttered. James knew she was right, but he couldn't explain. "I decided to talk to the bus driver after we get off at school." "That's great, James. I bet he'll talk to someone at the school and get it all to stop. You've taken enough from that weasel this year. It's got to stop." "Mm-hmm," James said as he tried to look for Blue. "Why did he go? I can't wait for him. I'll miss the bus." They waited for only a minute before the bus pulled to a stop at their corner. James had a giant knot in his stomach as he climbed the steps without Blue. As Grace and James took their seats, James craned his head to look out the window. "Do you think it's going to rain today?" he asked, hoping to make his window watching less strange. Grace turned to look out the window too, then gave James a strange look. "Looks perfectly clear to me," she said, settling back into her seat. Just as James was about to give up his search, he saw movement in the sky. Blue came into view, making a beeline for the bus, something dangling from his mouth. He flew toward the closing bus doors and managed to turn sideways and make it through the last few inches of the closing door. However, this time his tail didn't make it all the way out of the way of the door.
"Ouch!"
Blue yelped as the bus doors closed on his tail. Whatever was dangling from his mouth fell and bounced toward the bus driver's feet. The doors registered something blocking the door and opened back up. Blue got his tail safely in the bus and picked up what he'd dropped. He turned and walked gingerly towards James. A mouse. The thing that hung from Blue's mouth was a freshly caught dead field mouse.
"That hurt,"
Blue mumbled, talking around his breakfast. He turned to look at his tail, making sure the door hadn't done any damage. He then extended his tongue and sucked the mouse into his mouth. One cringeworthy crunch and a swallow, and it was gone. James tried to keep his face neutral despite the churning in his stomach, a combination of nerves and disgust.
"So, are we talking to the bus driver soon?"
Blue asked. James gave a small nod, not looking at him. This day was going to be tricky with an invisible dragon talking to him all day.
"Good. You give him the details about what's happening, and I'll be right there with you. Be sure to talk loud. The driver looks old. Sometimes they don't hear so well."
The bus stopped at its last designated pickup corner before dropping off at school. Ben's stop. James had a better chance of dodging Ben's elbow in the morning. If Mom and Blue are right, then he won't have to dodge any more elbows. That was a nice thought. Sure enough, when Ben passed by, he managed to duck just in time. Ben let out a sarcastic laugh that seemed to say, "I'll get you next time," and then continued to his assigned seat at the back of the bus. Blue had crawled under the bus seat, but that didn't stop James from hearing his low growl as Ben passed by. When the bus stopped at the front of the school, James waited for everyone to walk to the front of the bus so he could be the last to leave. He got out of his seat and stood sideways so Grace could go in front of him. "Do you want me to go with you?" she asked. "No, you go ahead. It'll only take a minute." "Good luck," she said, before skipping to the front of the bus. She waved to the bus driver as she passed, but he didn't notice. James's heart pounded and his arms felt heavy as he approached the bus driver. "Mr. James's mind went blank. What was the driver's name? Had he ever told them? The bus driver looked at James impatiently. James cleared his throat and continued, his face warm. "I was wondering, You need to get to school, kid. Go quick, I need to close the door, the driver said gruffly. James glanced at Blue, who had settled on the seat behind the bus driver. His eyes were squinted and a small line of smoke streamed from each nostril. He looked ready to pounce on the driver. I was hoping to talk to you about... I don't have time for this. If there's a problem, talk to your teacher. He pointed at the door. But... okay. This was going nowhere. At least he could say he tried. Chapter 11. James hung his backpack, being careful not to step on Blue, who stuck close to his heels as students around him also hung their backpacks. He looked around as he walked to his desk, still half expecting someone to shout, point, and yell, "Dragon!" James's desk was in the middle of the classroom, but Blue didn't settle under the desk like he had in James's room. As Mrs. Anderson went through the plan for the day, Blue paced up and down the aisle, clearly agitated. Occasionally, James would catch him mumble words like, "Irresponsible adults," and, "It's his job." James tuned him out as he focused on the teacher. Remember, for those participating in the mayor's writing competition, the first draft of your article is due tomorrow, Mrs. Anderson said. James groaned internally. He was running out of time to think of a genius idea and actually write it down. He watched Blue pace for a while longer as the teacher's words and the sounds of the classroom drifted around him. Suddenly, Blue stopped where he was, sat up straight, and nodded to himself. He hurried back to James. In one big leap, he was on James's desk, nose to nose, looking right into his eyes. A few papers fell off James's desk, but he stared straight ahead, leaning slightly back. Blue leaned forward more, following his movement. "I know what we're going to do," Blue said. James didn't dare answer out loud. He reached his foot out and pulled his fallen papers over to him, and then bent down to pick them up. He jerked his head toward the floor to acknowledge Blue's statement and tell him to get off the desk. The morning continued as normal, math, reading, and science. Blue dozed through most of it. When the bell rang for recess, James stood and watched Blue stretch like a cat underneath his desk, his claws catching on the old carpet strings. "Are you playing Foursquare today?" his friend Sawyer asked as they walked outside. "Definitely," James said. "Sweet, I'll hurry and get a ball." Sawyer rushed out the double doors of the school. As James played Foursquare, Blue soared overhead, stretching his wings. It was hard to focus on the ball when all he wanted to do was watch his new friend soar. It was easy to see that the sky was the place for a dragon. He twisted, turned, dove, swooped, and looped through the air as effortlessly as a dolphin in water. Blue was made for the air. "James, your turn," Sawyer yelled, pulling him from his odd daze. "Right, sorry." He joined the game as Blue landed to watch for the last few minutes of recess. When the recess aide blew her whistle to signal the end of recess, there was a collective groan from the Foursquare players. "Who wants to play again at lunch?" Brian asked. James joined all the others in enthusiastically raising their hands. "I'll put the ball back," James volunteered. It was the perfect excuse to walk slowly across the playground and get a minute to talk to Blue. "So, what is your big plan?" he asked Blue when he was confident no one was listening. Blue leaped in front of James, flapping his wings quickly so he could hover and look him in the eyes. "At lunchtime, I'm going to teach you how to roar," he said with a grin. Chapter 12. After an extensive math lesson and some time to work on homework, the lunch bell rang. James hardly ate anything and subtly dropped his turkey burger on the floor for Blue, who swallowed it whole. He was the first of his Foursquare group done eating, but instead of waiting for them to finish, he headed out to the playground. "Follow me," Blue said. He led James around the corner of the school. James looked around and didn't see any teacher or students anywhere. He turned his focus to the dragon. "We'd better be quick. If a teacher finds me, they'll send me back out to the playground." "Just listen. I'm going to teach you something that my father taught me, that his father taught him, that his father taught him. This skill goes back to the very first dragons that ever existed." James leaned against the wall, arms at his sides, hanging on Blue's every word. "I'm going to teach you how to roar," Blue said. James pushed off the wall and crossed his arms. "This should be good." "Square your shoulders like this." Blue shifted his weight from front paw to front paw and then straightened to his full height. "Take a deep breath in, feel the warmth build deep in your belly, and then let it all out." Blue released a sound unlike anything James had ever heard before. He instinctively jumped backward and covered his ears. The sound reverberated through the air, the windows of the school shook in their frames, and the ground rumbled beneath his feet. Blue's eyes turned from black to red, and smoke billowed from his mouth. Blue closed his mouth, and a heavy silence settled around them. James slowly uncovered his ears, and his arms fell to his sides. Blue cleared his throat.
That felt good. I haven't let out a good roar like that in a while.
James's back scraped against the brick wall as he slid to sit against the wall, his shaky legs no longer able to hold him. Steam and smoke were still rising from Blue's nostrils. James looked around, shocked that people didn't come running to see what had happened. There should have been alarms going off, kids crying, and first responders swarming the school. "Well, humans don't roar," James said, his voice small, still in shock. Blue walked in front of James and put his front paws on James's bent knees, looking him directly in the eye. James noticed the dragon's eyes had returned to their normal dark color.
"When I told my father I was too young to roar, he told me it's not about the roar, it's about confidence. He said to only roar in defense, and not to scare other animals just for fun. That's not what respectable dragons do."
He hung his head.
"Maybe I broke that rule a little with Bootsy."
"She'll be fine, and you didn't roar," James said, running a trembling hand through his hair. Blue's advice felt like something his own dad would have said. Maybe not those exact words, since he isn't a dragon, but the same general idea. "I'd better get to Foursquare before someone comes around the corner and sees me talking to myself."
"Great, I'll get some more flight time."
As he took off, James watched him for another minute before joining the game. After recess, it was time for a history lesson. Blue must have thought James was bored during the teacher's lecture of the Revolutionary War, because he took it upon himself to entertain him. Mrs. Anderson read notes and showed a slideshow about the war. Blue stood on a desk behind the teacher and imitated her movements dramatically. James managed to stifle his laughter until Blue pretended to have been shot by a British musket and fell dramatically to the floor. James's face warmed as the teacher and most of the class turned to look at him. "Is there something funny?" Mrs. Anderson asked, her mouth in a straight, tight line. "No, sorry. Can I get the pass?" "Yes, it's on the table. Hurry back." Blue followed James into the hallway.
"I knew that would get a laugh out of you,"
Blue said proudly. James didn't answer because some of the classroom doors he was passing were open.
"Just remember what we talked about at recess. Confidence. Confidence. Confidence."
Blue said the last words as he bounced from one side of the hallway to the other. Chapter 13. Confidence. James repeated this word in his mind the rest of the day, and he thought it at the end of the day as he found his seat next to Grace on the bus. Blue curled up under the bus seat, careful to tuck in his tail so it wouldn't get stomped on. Grace had her nose in a cookbook as usual. This one was about baking different breads. The loaf on the cover made his mouth water just looking at it. He wondered if he could suggest that as a side for dinner sometime. Before he got the question out, his attention was caught by a movement at the front of the bus. James waited patiently and watched as Ben walked down the aisle toward him. He was flanked by a couple of his obnoxious buddies, all of them laughing and shoving each other. Confidence. James knew he had to wait for just the right moment. Grace lowered her book. She was holding her breath, and her eyes darted between James and Ben. Here it comes, James thought. Here's my moment. Ben pulled back his arm and took aim at James's head, but just before making contact, James caught Ben's elbow. He stood, looking Ben right in the eye, and shouted, "Stop it!" He let go of Ben's elbow with a small shove that knocked Ben slightly off balance. Ben steadied himself on the bench behind him, then stood tall with a look of fury on his face. "What the?" Ben said, regaining his balance. James didn't cower. He didn't even blink. "I'm sick of it. Stay away from me." James stood tall. He wondered if his eyes were red like Blue's had been when he roared. He certainly felt as though he could breathe fire. The fury faded from Ben's face. Was that fear that flashed in Ben's face? Before James got a good read on the bully, his expression changed to a look of indifference. "Whatever, man," Ben said, being careful not to touch James as he made his way around him and toward the back of the bus. Ben's friends followed behind, looking nervously at each other. When they'd all passed, James slumped back into his seat and glanced over at Grace. Her eyes were wide in shock. "What?" James asked, crossing his arms and resting his head back on the seat. "Nothing. Just... wow," Grace said, admiration shining in her eyes. Blue was right. That was a good feeling. Blue had come out from under the seat and was standing in the aisle looking towards the back of the bus. James glanced over his shoulder and saw Ben sitting quietly while his friends all laughed and talked to each other around him. He looked back and Blue caught his eye. He could feel the pride he felt in himself reflected in the dragon's eyes. James felt lighter as he walked home with Grace, Blue flying low over their heads. "Did you see his face?" Grace asked for the third time. "He didn't see that coming." James just smiled. Blue landed behind them and walked slowly. As Grace and James continued walking, they didn't see him pause and turn to their neighbor's house. The curtains in the front window opened, and Blue gave a respectful bow. Stan responded with a smile and a small wave, his eyes misty with memory. Chapter 14. What is that? A bright light was shining around the edges of James's closed door. He opened the door slowly and saw Blue's book in the middle of the floor where it had fallen earlier, with the same glow as when Blue had appeared the day before. "That's my cue," Blue said, walking towards the book. "Wait, what do you mean? You're going back?" James's heart tightened. He had become rather fond of Blue. "Will I see you again?" "You'll see me every time you read my book. I'm there on almost every page, and in the book itself." He continued over to the book until he was right on the edge in the brightest of the book's glow. James squinted and tilted his head up, barely able to see him. "I won't appear again like I did today, but I'm always here. I am so proud of you." And with those final words, he leaped into the air and dove into the book head first. A light flashed, and James had to look away. When he opened his eyes again, Blue was gone. James stood staring at the book, breathing fast. Despite only knowing Blue for a short time, it still felt like a loss. James sat down hard in his desk chair, not taking his eyes off the book. His eyes glazed over as he thought about all that had happened. James wasn't sure how long he had sat there just looking at the book on the floor. He vaguely remembered hearing Mom come home, but didn't go to greet her. Now he could hear noise in the kitchen. Dinner was almost ready, but he was definitely not hungry. He slowly turned his chair around and picked up his pencil. He tapped the pencil on his book a few times before opening the notebook. He flipped through the notes he'd taken while interviewing Blue. Suddenly, James sat up straight, his feet flat on the floor. He snatched up his pencil and began to write. James wrote and erased, and then wrote some more. Once he was satisfied with what was written on paper, he pulled out his school laptop and began to type. Hours later, James typed 2 final words at the bottom of the page. The end. Technically, those words don't go at the end of a news article, but it felt good to write them, so he left it. James stood, hands on his lower back, and leaned back. His back popped in a few places. He yawned and glanced at the clock. His eyes went wide when he saw it was almost 11 o'clock. His hands dropped to his sides, and he spun around when he heard his mom's voice. "You're done?" she said with a yawn. "Yes, I can't believe how late it is. I'm surprised you let me stay up. I came in a few hours ago to tell you go to bed and finish in the morning, but you were in the zone. You didn't even hear me when I brought in some dinner. I figured inspiration had struck, and I wasn't going to get in the way of that." James looked at his desk and saw a cold bowl of soup, 2 rolls, and a glass of water. He grabbed a roll and took a big bite, suddenly ravenous. It stuck in his dry throat, and he grabbed his glass of water. "I'm glad. I finished my first draft, and I'm ready to hand it in. I would love to read it another time. I'm going to bed, and so should you, mister. Pajamas, brush teeth, and I'll see you in the morning." She gave James a hug and then left to go to her own room. James glanced proudly at the article on his laptop one more time before getting ready for bed. Chapter 15. James felt as though he had barely closed his eyes when his alarm went off. He forced himself up and sent his assignment to the downstairs printer before getting dressed. Blue's book lay open on the floor exactly as he'd left it the night before, and he was hit with a fresh wave of sadness. He felt sluggish as he stomped down the stairs. A box of oatmeal packets was on the kitchen counter waiting for him. Grace's empty bowl was in the sink. He glanced at the clock and quickly prepared his oatmeal. He ate fast, burning his tongue a little, then dropped his empty bowl into the sink. It clattered loudly against the other dishes. "Good morning, James," his mom called from the office. Too rushed to reply, James ran up the stairs 2 at a time and went straight to the bathroom to brush his teeth. He ran his hands through his hair and called it good. He sprinted back to his room to get his backpack and froze in the hallway. The vase. It was fixed. He looked closer. It wasn't just fixed, it looked as if it had never been broken to begin with. He went into his room and grabbed his backpack, then hurried downstairs. He popped into the office to grab his printed assignment and gave his mom a quick kiss. "Have a great day," she said, glancing up from the computer. "You too, love you," James said. Grace was waiting for James by the front door. She was looking at her watch and tapping her foot. "Let's go, James," she said, looking at her watch. As they power-walked towards the bus stop, James looked toward Stan's house. Memories of a little blue dragon filled his mind. A lump formed in his throat. "You go ahead, Grace. I'll meet you there." James cleared his throat as he ran up Stan's driveway. As James was about to knock, the door swung open. "Hello, James. I was just coming to read my paper on the porch. How are you? Any new adventures lately?" The glint in Stan's eye was all the indication James needed to see to know that Stan knew exactly what had happened. "You knew that Blue would come out of the book, didn't you? That was the craziest day ever. He snuck into the kitchen and tried to steal food. He caught a field mouse. He broke the vase, but now it's not broken." James' words came out fast, and he was breathing fast by the end of his tirade. Stan looked at him blankly. "Interesting," Stan said, adjusting his glasses on his face. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, but it sounds like an adventure." "What do you mean you don't know what I'm talking about? The books you gave me, the magic." "Oh, look, here comes the bus. You'd better hurry," Stan said, pointing up the road. But... James couldn't believe this. The bus pulled up to the stop. James turned and made a run for it. "There is something magical about reading a book for the first time," Stan yelled after him as he ran down Stan's driveway. James paused and turned in time to see Stan settle down with his newspaper. Stan winked at him over the top and then covered his face with the paper. James continued his dash to the bus and made it just as the doors were closing. Luckily, the bus driver took pity on him and opened the doors again so he wouldn't have to do the walk of shame back to the house to ask his mom for a ride. "That was close," Grace said as James sat next to her. He nodded, his breathing still fast from the sprint to the bus. "Just glad I made it." He sat up taller as they came to the next bus stop. Ben's bus stop. It was time to see if the bullying had truly stopped. He stared hard at Ben as he got on the bus and walked down the aisle. He was ready to stand up for himself again if he needed to, but it ended up not being necessary. Ben didn't even look in his direction, just walked straight to his seat. Grace bumped his shoulder, and they fist-bumped. "I don't think he's going to be a problem anymore." James's heart filled with gratitude for the little blue dragon that gave him the confidence to roar. 6th grader wins mayor's writing competition. Dragon for Dinner series coming next month.